Game of Thrones Season 1. So before we get started, a quick disclaimer, this video will have no spoilers for the first season or anything else from Game of Thrones. I'll briefly go into plot points from the first 2 episodes at max, no more than that. These episodes are just setting up the story anyway, and I'm going to go into it so lightly you are not going to have anything spoiled. You can comfortably watch this video and find out whether you should watch Game of Thrones. The short answer is you should, but if you stay, don't worry, don't be scared, you're not going to get any spoilers here. Trust me, I know how you feel. I've had a few myself. If you haven't yet started Game of Thrones and you're watching this, I imagine you're here because you've heard from all sides, from your friends, the internet, especially the internet, everywhere, that you should be watching Game of Thrones, but you probably have a few misgivings based on things you've heard. I'm hopefully gonna, in this video, quell for you a few of those reasons and really convince you to get started, because this, if you haven't seen it yet, is one of the best things that are on TV. Now's a good time to get into Game of Thrones because Season 5 has just concluded and Season 6 isn't going to roll out until next year, so you've got a good amount of time to catch up, and it really doesn't take as long as it might seem. So without further ado, let's actually review the damn thing. Now, I can't review this without going into the story a little bit, but seriously, I'm going to gloss over it so much because there is so much to say. I could make an hour-long video just summarising the story, so I'm going to give you the most basic plot of Game of Thrones that will hopefully get you somewhat interested, but might bore you somewhat, but you have to stick with it. Game of Thrones is a show about medieval politics. Now, I know that might not sound like the most interesting thing to be watching. It might sound pretty, I don't like politics, but if you've seen House of Cards, you're into that anyway. But regardless, Game of Thrones is more. You know, at its very base, it is a show about medieval politics, but it's so much more than that as well. It's a show about the characters within it, which are all very richly written. It is just a show about the consequences of politics in a time where there isn't quite as much restraint as we have nowadays, not as much civility in the idea that, you know, nowadays we don't go around plunging swords into people we don't like, so, you know. Ultimately, the title of the show sums up very well. Game of Thrones. This land is very much preoccupied. The whole political landscape is a literal game in which you try and get yourself onto the throne and everyone's partaking in it. It is a ruthless world where everyone wants the same thing and each different character is getting wrapped up in it, and there are very few people that aren't out for their own good and out for power. Everyone, almost everyone in this world is a selfish piece of crap. All these different houses in Game of Thrones, these different families are vying for the Iron Throne. The two houses that we focus on most during this season are the Starks and the Lannisters, especially the Starks. The Starks are led by Sean Bean's Ned Stark, who is our basic focal point for this season. He is one of the very few good characters in Game of Thrones, and he stands out like a sore thumb amongst everyone else, especially almost all of the Lannisters, which essentially serve as the evil house, but they also have the bigger claims to the throne. And for various reasons, which I won't go into, the Starks get embroiled in this Game of Thrones somewhat against their will. They are stuck within this political landscape of treachery, bribery, and violence, both of the physical and sexual kind. As I've said, there's so much more to the story of Game of Thrones than I can realistically tell you here. There is a lot going on, and if I made it sound boring, I apologise. I promise you, it really isn't, even if it does seem it on first glance. Give it some time, watch this series for at least one season. If you don't like it by the end of it, then okay, you're probably not going to, but I promise you that even if you do find the first few episodes boring, which I don't believe they are, I'll get to that in a minute, even if you do, stick with it, give it some time, it really is brilliant. But anyway, we have to start somewhere, so let's start with the world. One of the most impressive things about Game of Thrones is the world itself and the characters within it, and how George R.R. Martin, you know, the author of the novels, and the series directors have managed to forge this incredibly realistic fantasy world, which doesn't, you know, it's kind of juxtaposition, but it really makes sense when you actually watch it. If you don't enjoy fantasy, Game of Thrones is a hint of fantasy with more of a medieval historical setting. There are, of course, fantastical elements. There is magic in Game of Thrones, though very, very little, surprisingly little. There are creatures that aren't, you know, real in Game of Thrones, and again, there are very, very few of them, at least this far. So if you have misgivings against that kind of thing, don't worry. Game of Thrones feels like a realistic setting. And a lot of that is due to the uncompromising vision which is being realised by the series directors. They've done a fantastic job of bringing this world to life through various means, and they don't hold back. And you probably already know that, and they don't hold back. The world of Game of Thrones is disgusting. It is comprised of frequent violence, and as I've said, sexual violence especially. And what George R.R. Martin did in his books, apparently, haven't read them, but you know, He has depicted a world of incredible misogyny and violence and decrepitude. It is a horrible world that hasn't advanced, to the extent we have. We still have a bit of a way to go, but we're better than these guys are anyway. Essentially, Game of Thrones runs in a world where your political power, your stature, and your worth in life is determined by how well you can swing a sword, and the men don't allow women to swing swords, so they don't get anywhere, which is horrible. And that may, to some people, seem like this show is sexist. And in many ways, I disagree with that. And that's the big controversy of Game of Thrones, is whether it is misogynistic and sexist. And I would argue, mostly, no. What Game of Thrones does is depict a realistic medieval world, with a pinch of salt, we'll give or take the dragon eggs, but a real world, a real medieval world where violence and sexual violence weren't uncommon as they are now anyway. And so do we see a lot of it? Yeah, we do. We see it, and it's truly devastating to watch when you see these female characters getting used like this, and when you see male characters getting, stabbed and their heads cut off, and just so many people dying and being treated horrifically. Characters we care about being treated horrifically. We think that's disgusting. And that's what separates Game of Thrones from genuine misogyny. Game of Thrones depicts misogyny, but it doesn't indulge in it for the most part, and I'll get to that. It shows us the world of sexual violence and objectification of women, but it doesn't do it in a way that makes us think that's a good thing. It shows us how horrific that is, and it makes us glad that we've moved on as far as we have, though again, we still have a ways to go. However, there are some instances when the series struggles to keep its head above the waters of the male gaze. It sometimes will indulge a little too much in ways that are somewhat unnecessary and don't actually build the world and tell us that much. For example, I won't go into it obviously, explicit, but episode 7 especially, when you get to this moment, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. One character is giving apparently a very important speech, but the stuff going on in the background is so unnecessary and so distracting that you just, it's distracting. It's unnecessary as well. It's clearly not there for any reason other than to titillate, and that's ridiculous, and I don't approve of that. Most of the time, though, Game of Thrones does it in a way that is legitimate, and a legitimate storytelling technique that shouldn't be shied away from just because it's taboo. Another part of what makes the world of Game of Thrones so very compelling is the characters themselves and how well they've been written. For example, Ned Stark, who is one of the very few good characters in Game of Thrones. You love him. You love him all the way through, and he just shines, especially because of all the bad characters. Joffrey, played by Jack Gleeson, he's horrific. Jack Gleeson, I think, would have played a much better Malfoy, actually, now that I think about it, but he didn't, so I'll get over that for now. Maisie Williams does a great job as Arya Stark, Ned Stark's youngest child. She actually represents a fight against the patriarchy of the world. She is a girl that doesn't want to be weighed down with the constraints that are artificially placed on her by the world she lives in, and in that way Arya is one of the best characters in Game of Thrones, especially in later seasons, which I won't go into. Sansa Stark is also played by Sophie Turner, Arya Stark's sister. She, in this season, is pretty annoying. She's a bit of a spoilt brat, but later on she does grow into her own as a character, so give her a chance for now. And then across the sea we have the two Targaryen siblings, Daenerys Targaryen especially, who is being wed to a Dothraki, which is basically a tribal warlord, in order to raise an army and take back the throne. She's being forced into this by her sister, and that's also a very brilliant story, very tragic story. I will not go into that though, I just want to gloss over it, but it is very interesting. The only complaint I have is that Daenerys doesn't actually get to do that much this season, although I can see that it's leading somewhere, but she's such a good character, I really want her to start, getting things done, but I understand that we have to wait for that. And without doubt in my mind, the best character in all of Game of Thrones, when I stand by this, is Tyrion Lannister, the dwarf played by Peter Dinklage, fantastically by Peter Dinklage. He's won Emmys and Golden Globes for his performance. He does a fantastic job, he brings the character with moral ambiguity and humour, and in each subsequent season, I've only seen up to season 3 so far, he just gets better and better and better. I love him. He deals with being a male, which would be a one-up in this world, but he's also a dwarf, and so the only thing that actually keeps his head afloat is that he is a Lannister. He is a descendant of Tywin Lannister, and that gives him status just because he has the same last name as him. And that's what's keeping him alive. And you get a lot of insight into his character, especially, as you go on, you get more and more, and you feel bad for him, even though at first he comes off as a bit of an asshole, to be honest, but he comes into his own as well, and he's really one of the most compelling characters on the show. No one who watches him will ever forget him. I certainly won't. Everyone I know loves him. Just Tyrion Lannister. That said, I have a few nitpicks in terms of characters. For example, Ned Stark's bastard child, Jon Snow. He isn't that good a character as far as I'm aware, and he is one of the most iconic with the series, so I guess he does grow into his own in later seasons. He does become a significant part. At the moment, though, in season 1, he is pretty boring for the most part. He's got a tragic backstory because he's a bastard and he is rejected, much like Tyrion Lannister is the dwarf. But the problem with Jon Snow is he doesn't even have the last name of Ned Stark. So he just doesn't really go right with the world. I think he will get better, but it's kind of hard to put into words, but he's just not compelling at this time. And that extends to another character called Lord Varys. I think that's how you say his name. If you've seen it, you know I'm talking about the bald guy. He has been, in his past, castrated. They get straight into that and they say, this guy is castrated. And that's his kind of tragic backstory. But every time we interact with this character, every time he's the focus of a scene, it's always brought up every single time. It's like, oh, what's between my legs? Ugh. And it's like, yeah, we already know that, though. Like, we understand, so could you not carry on telling us? Could you not keep shoving it down our oh, wait, you can't do that. Sorry. Yeah, overall, it just feels a little bit unnecessary the way they hammer that point home. And, beyond that, he's actually a very good character. It's just that one thing that's kind of annoying. But that's kind of a nitpick because there are so many very good characters, and it's incredible especially that there can be so many good characters and so many different storylines, and the show keeps up with it all. It keeps up with everything, and I always felt that I knew these characters, and it also showed restraint. For example, during this season you're going to hear the name Stannis mentioned, and you might be wondering, who is Stannis? Have we seen him before? No, he actually shows up in season 2. Again, no spoilers. He shows up in season 2 and you're like, oh, okay. So you realise that they kept him out so as not to crowd, not to overcrowd, but they mention him and build up to his appearance. So that's like, isn't that good that we don't have him coming in making everything even harder to keep up with? I just think that level of restraint, it's just, they clearly know what they're doing and they've done a fantastic job of making it very easy to keep up with. That said, you can't be on your phone the whole time while watching Game of Thrones. You will fall behind. It's still a complicated story, but they do a good job with what they've done. And what makes Game of Thrones so compelling to everyone, I think, is the moral ambiguity. And this season will teach you as well that the good characters, they do sit out like a sore thumb, and through one way or another, the season is going to teach you that doesn't go down too well with the political landscape, which is made up of evil, evil, evil characters. And that is what hooks you, is that you don't know. Very few characters are straight good, straight bad. There's normally a mixture, and they're normally forged by the world they're in, so you have a degree of sympathy. And it just creates some of the most compelling storytelling that I've seen in TV, I have to be honest. When things go wrong in Game of Thrones, you really feel it. Some of the most dramatic moments are created, and you are just completely there, you're completely along with it, and you feel everything. And it is incredible that they've managed to do that. I give Game of Thrones Season 1 a 9 out of 10. They have done such a fantastic job with this show. If you haven't started watching it, start watching it, please. But be aware, it is very explicit. But please, if you normally have a misgiving about, sex and TV and movies, it really is used, for the most part, quite well in this. And don't condemn the whole show if you don't agree with it. There is so much more to this than that. And I really believe you've really got to start it. Thank you guys, that was my review of Game of Thrones Season 1. I'm sorry if this review was a bit longer, but there's so much more to go into when you're reviewing about 10 hours of content, so I hope you give me a pass on that one. I'm going to do a review of Season 2, it's going to go up tomorrow, and well, thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe, like, favourite, all that really helps me a lot in the boxes below. Thank you so much again for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow.